we talk about practices, and so what we're doing is we are saying this refounding that we discuss in the book is really about a re-entering into the history and the tradition of the church. Much of it that was there before the Reformations came along. And there's language that we introduce. We talk about Parish, we talk about Abbey, which we'll talk about in a moment. And you're very sensitive and aware of some of the ways in which Christian mission actually took place through some of those movements. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, one of the periods of history that fascinate me, one of the hinges of history, if you like, is what happened in what is called the Dark Ages. Dark because the light of learning went out, dark because the light of Christianity went out. So there was this brief period of several hundred years, brief in the sense of the whole of the history of Europe, when the presence of the Christian church was overshadowed by the arrival of the new pagan tribes. The tribes, in fact, that have given their names to Europe today, the Franks in France and the Lombards and the Saxons and so many others that came in to Europe at that time. So they shaped Europe, reshaped Europe in their tribal images. And the point about these people was that they were warriors and they took what they wanted by the sword. Now there came a time when they started to invite Christian missionaries because they could see that there was something here that was valuable. And missionaries came, both from Rome and from Ireland, the Celts and the Romans in various parts of Europe. And both of those sets of missionaries engaged in practices that were strikingly different than the culture that had invited them. And one of the marked pieces in all of this was simply this, that they could have said to the warriors, look, the work we're doing is so important, you need to feed us, you need to resource us, you need to help us with our programs and so on, so that we can take the gospel to the poor. But they didn't. Instead, they said, no, we will earn our own living with the work of our hands. And that was prophetically important because they were saying to the warrior class, we're going to reject violence as a way of earning our living. We're going to side with the poor, but we're also going to give dignity to work. Now actually, you can't have a decent society unless work has dignity. So that was an amazing thing to do as part of living out the gospel. And so that has led me to ask the question, so what would prophetic actions be like in the 21st century? What would it take in order to demonstrate the gospel in these kind of radical ways?
Right. And we picked that up in the book, in which the first thing, I think, what we're saying in the book is that the bubbling in the ferment that God is up to is the reweaving of the social fabric of life that's been torn apart. And we don't mean by that just kind of secular social work or anything else like that, but what God's up to, as Paul describes in Ephesians, is fundamentally the remaking of the world, doxologically. And that takes place, that happens in small societies and communities. And so we pick up some of what Martin's described in terms of language of parish and of Abbey. And Abbey, the language of Abbey, is not the language of let's find a place to escape and wall ourselves off from the terrible things that are happening. Let's internalize a spirituality of our own. The Abbey, as Marx pointed out, was really a place where God's people came together to begin to demonstrate, and as they dwelt with, what it meant to reweave the fabric of society in the midst of a breaking apart of society. So these are some of the metaphors that for us become critically important. Even we talk about the recovery of parish, which we say is not a religious word, it's a secular word, and it's really about a geography and a place. And this happens in England very early on, after the Romans have left, where Parish, when out of Canterbury, the church, then would be the Catholic Church, begins to engage this devastated place. Parish was a way in which Christians were saying, we establish ourselves here to remake and reweave the social life out of our doxological and liturgical practices. That's the kind of thing that's at the core of the refounding for which we are calling.
And you're interested now, beyond the book, if you like, in what you're calling Everyday Abbey. And
The Everyday Abbey.
That's an episode to come.
It is what we are seeking to do is say, how do we live into the practices that we're beginning to describe in this book, recognizing that across North America, as we go, all kinds of people are hungering to know how to engage the bubbling of the ferment. And so as we begin to unfold what we call the Everyday Abbey, it's a way of inviting people not into the answer, but into co-discovering together how to refound Christian life. So yeah, stay tuned. We're really excited about that.